I would like to start by thanking the Shelburne Museum for inviting me to speak. It's a huge honor. I'd also like to thank the staff here for putting together such a gorgeous exhibit. I hope many of you have had a chance to see it. They've really done an incredible job. And this is my first speech, so forgive me if I get a little bit nervous. My very first fashion show, at an Alexander McQueen trunk show, I was helping backstage, and I was so nervous that I accidentally poked a model in the eye. Fortunately, she was okay, so I'm hoping this goes a bit better. I think you guys are all a little too far away for me to get you in the eye. And please hold your questions until the end. I will be more than happy to answer them in the last 10 or so minutes. So a bit about my background. I am an artist and illustrator and a fashion designer. I graduated Parsons School of Design in New York City and spent several years working in the fashion industry as a designer and illustrator before I moved up to Vermont. While I was in New York, I worked with a number of companies, including J.Crew, Ann Taylor Loft, The Gap, Express, and Diane von Furstenberg and Say Cashmere as an intern. Since I relocated to Vermont 2.5 years ago, I've met lots of amazing people. I'm very thankful to be part of such a vibrant and supportive community. By the way, can everyone hear me in the back? Yes, okay. So in terms of what I do here, as some of you might know, I started teaching a class in fashion drawing 2 years ago in Burlington. That class has been very successful, and I now teach the basics of fashion drawing to teens and adults on a seasonal basis. The other aspect of what I do, and what I was trained to do in New York, is illustration, specifically fashion illustration. So this can mean anything from drawings of clothing for fashion design companies to communicate their ideas for upcoming seasons, to artistic renderings of models and clothing for use in advertising. You'll see I have a table set up over there with some note cards and prints of favorite art pieces that we can check out at the end of the talk. So, what is fashion? To me, fashion is the art of clothing. There's something breathtaking about walking into a room like the Webb Gallery and seeing the stunning work of decades of designers. These designers are both artists and craftspeople. It's amazing to me the volume of care and time that has gone into that fabric, and the care that goes into the photo shoots at magazines, the clothes in vintage stores, the clothing on people walking around town, street clothes, outfits that people put on just because they felt like it, because there was something they wanted to express that day with a certain color that just had to be said with lemon yellow. To me, that is art. It is what inspires me, and it is what I love communicating to the world. There are many other sources of inspiration in my life, but fashion is something that, even when I try to avoid it, I always seem to come back to. So I'd like to share a brief sample of artwork with you before I launch into the talk. We do have a lot of material to cover, so I'll try to keep this short. Here are some of the pieces I created on site at the museum several weeks ago. And you'll see I sort of pieced them together on the computer. It's actually, each one is just one sketch, but I usually have fine arts reproductions done, and because I did them very recently, I didn't have time to go get them done. But you'll see them pieced together. Most of these are in pencil. This one is a gown by Christian Siriano, who was a Project Runway winner. This is Carolina Herrera, a beautiful dress in a print. I just thought this is one of my favorites actually from the exhibit. And this is another one. This is Emmanuel Ungaro. And this one had the mannequin behind it, so I kind of included that. Some of the fashion drawing I do involves live models, which is always a challenge, but really exciting to have someone actually wearing the clothing. And I have brought a live model into the class at Burlington City Arts that I teach in fashion drawing. So we're really lucky that when the students are learning, they actually have a live model there, which is typically something you don't find in Burlington, but in New York, it's pretty standard. And this is a more abstract piece. I was just watching the fashion show that they had running in the exhibit, and I tried to catch some of them very quickly. It reminded me of the fashion shows I used to help with in New York, so I just kind of scribbled down some of those poses. And this is a piece by Prabal Goring, who is a designer who's just emerged as a big name. And I was particularly drawn to all the different sort of ribbons and the way they were moving on this piece. So I tried to capture that. And this was a more experimental piece that I did. I used some color in there, some different colored pens, and it's a little edgier. So that's show and tell. And again, thank you to the museum for putting on such a gorgeous exhibit. It's really, it's incredible that we have this up here. So here's a quote I would like to share. This is from Mickey Drexler, the CEO of J.Crew, in a Wall Street Journal article, actually Wall Street Journal magazine article from June 10th, 2010. Whether you have wealth or not is irrelevant when it comes to appreciating quality. Even if you can't afford it, you can respect it. I took an informal poll this week on the streets of Burlington to see how Vermonters felt about fashion. Of the 16 people I surveyed, 69% of people said they felt they had no connection to fashion. 69% of people could not accurately identify what the clothing they were wearing was made of. 75% of people did not know where their clothing was made. They could usually name the store, but they didn't know, no idea what country. 63% said they did have some connection to clothing, not fashion, but clothing, as clearly they were wearing it. Now, I am absolutely certain that Vermonters have clothing exchanges, that some shop at vintage and consignment stores or even run them. You might be surprised to learn that many people among us are actually independent clothing makers, rural folks who spin their own wool, knitters, home sewers, dressmakers, and yes, even clothing designers. And I would guarantee that everyone here can recognize a quality clothing item when they see one, even if it's maybe just the one we're wearing because it fits. It seems that lots of people today are convinced that fashion and clothing are two very different things. And yet we all wear clothes. Well, if there's one thing I can promise you, after all this time working in the fashion industry, it's that the fashion industry is actually a clothing industry. So let's call it clothing. Everyone sitting here is wearing clothing. Clothing is a huge part of our lives, our economy, our day-to-day function, and yes, our communities. While I was in New York, I worked for both large-scale companies and smaller independent designers, and I was shocked that after so many years of shopping in retail stores, I really had no idea where my clothes came from. As I continued to learn more, I realized that there was a huge gap in terms of what information is public and what the public might not know and would probably appreciate knowing. So today I'll be giving you a glimpse into the world of clothing manufacturing based on my experience as a designer. And I'll also discuss where I think fashion is headed and how Vermont can be a part of that. I'm hoping that by the end of the talk, you'll have a better understanding of how clothes are made, what about the process of clothing manufacturing needs fixing, and more importantly, to start thinking about ways that you can be involved in a local fashion movement. My disclaimer here is that I'm not an official expert on the environmental or health impacts of the fashion industry. Much information about what goes on in foreign factories is actually not available to the public, and it is only recently, within the last 5 or so years, that organizations have emerged who've started investigating existing practices and offering better alternatives. Even as a designer in New York City, my questions about the origins of my employer's textiles often went unanswered. So I will give you my perspective as a designer based on what I do know and the research I've done, and hope that you'll be inspired to do more of your own research. So I'll start by asking the question, where does our clothing come from? Let's think on that, just a minute. Based on my survey results, I'm guessing that most people would answer the store. I've prepared a few visuals to go along with a mini lesson that I call Where Does Our Clothing Come From? Also known as the clothing stork. I use the analogy of a stork because it so often seems like the garments we see in stores are simply dropped from the sky. Okay. Now, we'll see, I'll just go through these one by one. This overview is a general model based on corporate structures I encountered in New York. I'll use the term mass fashion when referring to corporate chain stores like the ones you see in malls and who have nationwide or international distribution. Know that there are many in-betweens and no two companies are exactly the same, but most do use this process at least to some degree as they make their products. So step one in the fashion food chain is financial planning. The clothing you see in retail chain stores is generally first conceived of by a merchandising or planning team of financial experts who have analyzed last year's sales to try to determine what sold best and to predict on that basis what will sell the next year. There are also trend bureaus or trend forecasting agencies that play a major role in the fashion industry by deciding what colors and trends they think will be relevant in future seasons. The trend cycle is a fixture in fashion. There are varying opinions on the importance of trends. I won't comment too much on that here. I'll simply say that the industry has been predicting a green trend for several years now, and many designers are already moving towards organic and eco-friendly materials and looking for ways to make their businesses better for the communities they serve and for the communities who produce their products. Step two is fabric sourcing and design. So I'll talk about design. While a small-scale fashion company might be owned and operated by the designer him or herself, mass fashion companies employ a team of designers to handle only very specific tasks: sketching, fabric sourcing, and garment trim, trend spotting, and in some cases, color and styling choices. As a former designer, I feel compelled to mention that, believe it or not, most fashion designers are not necessarily very well paid. Designer salaries may be even lower than those of their counterparts involved in clothing production at that very same company, such as the executives, production team, and merchandisers. Furthermore, small-scale independent designers typically put much of their own resources into starting up their companies, so their compensation might be even less. Also, I should mention that these independent designers are often left very vulnerable to copyright abuses, as copyright laws are extremely lax when it comes to clothing design. What this translates to is that smaller-scale designers and clothing startups are up against a huge challenge in trying to create better product lines and to offer alternatives to conventional modes of production. Step three, production. Once the sample garments have been created and selected, those selections are sent to the technical design and production teams. The production team is in communication with foreign fabric mills, either in China, Hong Kong, or elsewhere. And this is where the designing stops and the negotiating starts. A key role of the production team is what's called costing. This essentially means bargaining for the lowest prices with fabric producers as well as the factory owners who will direct the cutting and sewing of the garments. Keep in mind that all garments start with fabric and then must be cut into pieces according to a pattern. That pattern is made by a pattern maker, usually in-house at the company or sometimes at the factory. And then the pieces have to be sewn together with great accuracy on an industrial sewing machine and then finished with special details. And then it gets shipped back to the country where the garment will be sold. So the production team oversees the purchase of huge volumes of fabrics, including the dyeing, printing, and finishing, and finally the actual construction of the garment in the factories overseas. Typically, only a select few staff members within a company actually visit these factories. It's worth noting that each company sets its own standards. Some companies take a greater interest in the working conditions at the factories than others, and each factory operates differently according to its owner's practices and the country's laws and regulations. Any number of additional steps may be involved before the clothing finally appears in stores. Companies with nationwide distribution are able to negotiate huge volume deals with foreign suppliers and will often use a middleman of some sort to arrange production in the cheapest way possible. This usually means that your garment has multiple countries of origin in whatever way is decided upon by the production team and/or middleman, and of course with cost in mind. Most mass fashion companies have some form of testing that they will do on their garments before they send them to stores. It typically encompasses testing for certain toxic chemicals, specifically the ones that might bring on legal problems, but not all companies have the means to perform their own tests. Plus, government regulations only apply to a select few contaminants and speak to flammability questions. Once products are in stores, an entire team of marketing experts is then responsible for getting the merchandise out the door. If you're feeling a bit overwhelmed just listening to this, I don't blame you. Fashion is a big business, and it's not always profitable. Labor costs and commodity prices are constantly in fluctuation, and no sale is ever guaranteed. Which leads me to my next topic. Why would anyone want to be a designer? Just kidding. The next topic is, what's the problem? Environmental and health concerns. So let's look at some of the health and environmental issues associated with existing practices in textile and garment production. I have a resource sheet that is over on that table over there. I encourage everyone to take one after the talk and start looking into those and other resources at home. And also look around the internet. There's a lot of information out there. So as I go through these issues, you'll notice I'll be combining the environmental and the health concerns into one major topic. In my opinion, an environmental concern is a health concern, either to the factory workers or to the community living in the vicinity of the factory. Also, the toxics and pollutants involved in production are to some degree even in trace amounts in your clothing. In 2007, New Zealand's government found clothing imported from China to contain dangerous levels of formaldehyde. This is just one example, and certainly a reason to ask for more research. So, textile creation. We'll only have time to get to a few of the major categories today, but there are countless other textiles out there. I'll be citing several statistics as I go. I would like to thank greenchoices.org for allowing me to cite some of their material. I've also referred to Environmental Health Perspectives Journal, alternate.org, and Oregon Tilth, among others. So cotton. We will start with cotton. Cotton is the most pesticide-intensive crop in the world. In the United States, much of what we wear is made of cotton. Cotton requires huge tracts of land and volumes of water to grow. It's also extremely pesticide-intensive and typically involves herbicides and chemical defoliants. Organic cotton is a much better alternative. It is, however, significantly more expensive to produce. And currently, organic cotton represents only 0.03% of all cotton produced worldwide. Polyester and synthetics. Many people don't realize that polyester, which is found in everything from fleeces to dress shirts to pillow stuffings, is a petroleum byproduct. Both polyester and nylon are non-biodegradable and are created from fossil fuels. Polyester manufacturing also uses large amounts of water for cooling, chemical lubricants, and lots of energy. Recycled polyester textiles are available, but it's debatable whether or not chemical fibers are the best future direction. Rayon. Rayon is an artificial fiber created from wood pulp. It's a natural fiber, so it's renewable, but it gets mixed environmental reviews because of high water consumption and deforestation when old growth trees are used. Also, the chemicals needed to process rayon, caustic soda and sulfuric acid, are hazardous. Wool. Sheep's wool is a great source of fabric. It's been used for centuries. However, modern production of wool typically involves use of organophosphate sheep dip, a nerve-damaging chemical that's caused widespread illness among garment and agricultural workers in the UK, where much wool is produced. Leather, suede, and fur. And I know that there's animal rights activists and there's different ways to view the animal skin issue. My perspective, as I'll talk about a little bit later, is that I feel like extending the life cycle of a garment is really important, and animal skins and hides and furs do tend to last a long time and they provide a lot of warmth. So in my opinion, there are upsides and downsides to the coin. But know that current methods for preparing leather, suede, and furs involve highly polluting tanning and dyeing processes. The shoe industry in particular is notoriously polluting for this reason, and also because solvents, glues, and other plastic coatings and filler materials can be very harmful to environment and health. PVC. PVC, polyvinyl chloride, a known carcinogen, It is still found in raincoats and rain boots, purses, vinyl products, aprons, and other clothing items. PVC is legal and it is still found in clothing in the US. Some retailers are phasing it out independently and others are continuing to buy into it. So better alternatives. What else is there? Hemp. Hemp has the potential to be grown with minimal environmental and health impact, particularly in Vermont where the climate is ideal, if it were legal. The hemp lobby is currently working to have the ban lifted on industrial hemp. There are also new fabrics being developed, some of which are already on the market. Lyocell and Tencel are two examples of fabrics engineered to be environmentally friendly. Linen, jute, and silk are other fibers from natural sources. All have great potential to be produced organically if enough attention is paid to the entire production cycle. And then we have textile, dyeing, and finishing. I won't go into too much detail here, but the fashion industry is a huge source of pollution due to dyeing, bleaching, and the many other chemical processes involved in treating fabric. In fact, textile dyeing and bleaching, which produces bleaching in particular produces the toxic chemical dioxin, is the single most polluting step in garment production worldwide. There are also finishing agents such as waterproofing, flame-proofing, and anti-wrinkle agents that require use of formaldehyde. Other steps in clothing production include distribution, packaging, and clothing care such as washing, ironing, and dry cleaning. And each of these steps has additional implications that I won't get into, but I hope you will all research. A quick note, conventional dry cleaning uses perchloroethylene, a toxic solvent. Many people don't know this. Definitely ask your dry cleaner to make sure they're using eco-friendly methods. Additionally, there's a substantial amount of clothing in our landfills. Textile waste accounts for a small but significant percentage of the waste stream, and most people don't realize that textiles can actually be recycled or used for industrial purposes. Ultimately, it's important to consider the entire life cycle of a garment when we're looking at solutions and to try to evaluate the net environmental and health impact. Now you might be wondering, doesn't the government regulate what's in our clothes? The short answer is not really. Product labels only have to include the base fabric content, so if it's cotton, then cotton, and the country of origin where the product was sewn. So none of the chemicals I just mentioned. This labeling is overseen by the US Department of Agriculture. So you can see why organic labeling is very important. And fortunately, the USDA just adopted new standards for organic labeling in clothing based on GOTS, which is the Global Organic Textile Standards. And there are other independent agencies that certify textiles to be produced in an environmentally or health-conscious way. Most of them are based in Europe. So, back to Vermont. What does this all have to do with us? And what does it have to do with Vermont? So we could all go home and burn our clothing, or just go naked. Although I think both of these options might be a bad idea, especially in the winter. The first step, as far as I'm concerned, is research and regulation. It's shocking to me how little research has been done on clothing, and even more shocking that clothing labels do not accurately represent the full chemical content of a garment. I also believe that Vermont can and should be a pioneer in leading the local fashion movement. I like to think that the fashion industry is about 10 years behind food in becoming local and organic. And I hope that everyone here will continue thinking along those lines to make it happen. Today's global economy poses many challenges for clothing makers. Currently, we have a system where large-scale companies provide us with finished clothing items, often at extremely low prices. If you think about it, that's actually a huge service, and it's something we should be grateful for. But there's still much more work to be done. There's a great opportunity right now for innovation and collaboration. Plus, prices for overseas commodities and labor are rising, so it might actually become a financial necessity for us to go local sooner or later. And I personally believe that Vermont already has what it takes to be the leader in the fashion movement. I've come up with a little easy to remember saying to summarize what we can do to help create a more sustainable clothing future. And that's my next slide. Solution. Make it, find it, fix it, love it. Make it. So make it is the local section. And I have several different points here, so I'll just kind of go through them. Some may or may not apply to you. So the first suggestion in Make It is sew or learn to sew. Many Vermonters actually do this already, but pay close attention to your fabrics and your materials choices. Try to use recycled or repurposed garments and fabrics when you can. Seek out organics and eco-friendly fabrics and yarns dyed with non-toxic dyes and non-chlorine bleach. Go online and do research and make educated decisions. Buy local when you can. Check out the farmers markets for yarn spun from Vermont sheep's wool or alpaca. Help bring clothing manufacturing back to Vermont. If we can get manufacturing here, that means we've created jobs here. Vermont has great potential for sewing and manufacturing. The infrastructure and skilled labor for clothing manufacture is mostly overseas at this point, but there's no reason we can't bring it back. And in terms of crops that could be used for textiles, both wool and hemp are very well suited to Vermont's climate. The machinery required for processing would be a financial hurdle, but one that could be overcome. Support and help create a unified local fashion movement. Our resources go much further when we share them, and our marketing has more power when the effort is united. There are so many people who spin wool, home sewers, boutique owners, and even clothing manufacturers. It makes perfect sense to me that we can and should be sharing our resources. We have a Department of Agriculture, why shouldn't we have a Department of Clothing? And why don't we? A designer's co-op would be a great thing. It could be a place to show and sell garments, where designers could share resources and discuss their products with customers from visitors from out of town. Support independent designers. Since I moved to Vermont, I've met several independent designers. Kathy Griffiths is a Vermont-based designer with a plus-size line. Claudia Venin, whom some of you might know from the artist markets, does all of her own pattern making and designing. And April Cornell, a Vermont-based designer with an internationally recognized brand. And there are many other independent clothing makers here in Vermont who I haven't listed or haven't yet met. So just some food for thought for the clothing producers out there. If Vermont's design and retail community were to work together to create some sort of green labeling for local and or eco-friendly garments, we'd have a great way to maximize our marketing power and to market more effectively to other states and visitors. So perhaps a Vermont green label or a Vermont clean clothing label, something along those lines could be in the works. The next section is Find It, which is shop responsibly. Buy your clothing at vintage or consignment stores, go dumpster diving, have clothing exchanges. I wouldn't be surprised if someone told me that the concept of the clothing exchange originated in Vermont. I'm not sure if it's true, but Vermonters definitely seem to be very resourceful when it comes to finding alternatives to store-bought clothes. There are many great stores offering secondhand or vintage clothing, the Get Up Vintage Store, the Clothing Line, Battery Street Jeans, Barge Canal Market, and of course, flea markets, yard sales, the clothing exchange. And I personally love vintage stores and I love flea market shopping. To me, there's something very exciting about the history, the unknown factor of where the clothing has been that I find just incredible. And the people at many vintage stores are extremely knowledgeable about the clothing as well. So if you ask them questions, they can usually tell you what era it's from and interesting facts about the details in the clothing. Find designers and retailers you can trust. Support those who are doing the right thing. Patagonia, a company that specializes in outdoor gear, is a great company for eco-friendly clothing. For years, they've been pioneering more environmentally sound fabrics, and they were among the first to start thinking about the toxicity of textile dyes and then working directly with the fabric mills to develop better alternatives. If you're concerned about the higher price tags there, just keep in mind that they guarantee their garments for life and will repair or replace anything they manufacture. Also know that all research and development for textiles, eco-friendly shipping and packaging, and fair labor practices are included in their price tags. Plus, they support environmental nonprofits through their grants program. April Cornell is a Vermont-based designer who for decades has been offering high-quality products and at the same time undertaking substantial humanitarian projects through the foundation she established through her company. She now owns her own factory in India where she employs over 300 people and works directly with her suppliers to oversee production and ensure good labor conditions. A donation is built into the production cost of each garment and goes directly to the foundation that supports the local communities. Also, April's son Kelly is now developing an independent clothing label with his first collection featuring garments made of recovered fabrics. And this is a local project with overseas production that's tightly supervised and sustains the communities. There are also many eco-friendly companies, either online or in boutiques, Stewart and Brown Organic, Gaiam, Simple Shoes, to name a few. And many companies are already working on greening their products. Look around the internet and use the handout sheet. There are many designers and companies who've taken it upon themselves to do their part in the industry, and some for decades, like Yvonne Chouinard of Patagonia. I personally believe that these people are the unsung heroes of the fashion industry. The next section is Fix It. So raise the bar for manufacturers and government. Reform the system, both by encouraging better behavior from your favorite clothing makers and by demanding more regulations, standards, and labeling. Establishing standards will also help level the playing field for startup designers so that corporations are not at an automatic advantage. Ask questions. Talk to your favorite stores. Let them know that you care. Ask them to show you what they carry that's organic or eco-friendly. Boutiques and chains, both. Let them know about certifications for organic textiles, and let them know you care. Remember that it's a huge financial risk for a company to buy into eco-friendly fabrics that are much more expensive. It helps if they can keep hearing it from customers that the demand is there and that people will buy the clothes. Also, tell companies and boutiques exactly what styles of clothing you love and typically buy. This will help direct them towards better, more useful garments rather than just an offering of organic t-shirts when that's not what you need. Tell them you'd like to see everything in their store organic and eco-friendly sooner rather than later. There's nothing wrong with being loyal to your favorite brand or chain store. Obviously, they've done something right. They have a process that works for you. But do let them know that you care about where your clothes come from. Demand research. If you are affiliated with a university or an environmental studies program, look into funding sources for research on chemical content and/or environmental or health impact of clothing production. Demand standards and regulation. This could mean lobbying the US government to take a good look at what's in our clothing and what clothing labels should look like. Maybe they should list everything from dyes to finishing agents, as well as all countries involved in production on every garment label. We could also be lobbying for mandated fair labor and pollution standards and making these specific to the clothing industry. And one more thing too that I'd like to mention is also maybe we can rethink a little bit our expectations of colors or cuts or fabric softness. Remember there's very chemical softeners that go into making your clothing so soft at times. And also the dye agents, as I said before, can be very polluting. So if we rethink, maybe it'll make it easier on the clothing manufacturers as well. And the last section is love it. So buy only what you love and love what you buy. Only buy what you're going to wear. When I was younger, my mom used to say, your eyes are bigger than your stomach at the dinner table when I would take more food than I could eat. And I think sometimes our eyes are a little bit bigger than our stomachs when it comes to clothing. And that's okay, but it's something we can work on. Appreciate what you have. Vermonters are leaders in this area. Don't give in to the pressure to have a new outfit for every occasion. Look for clothes that fit and flatter your body type, and only buy sale items if you're sure you'll wear them. As consumers, especially in this country, we often associate a low price with some kind of success. We found a bargain. But in actuality, a low price reflects a loss on somebody's part, either the manufacturer, the laborers, or the producers of the material. Clothing should not be cheap or free, just as legal services, a good meal, electrical wiring are not free. All of these things we expect to pay for, and we should expect to invest in our clothing made the right way. Of course, there are always economic concerns, but if you always go back to the question of will I wear it, I think that's a good place to start. Also, do not accept free t-shirts. I'm serious about this. It's fine if you need them. Take free clothing if you need it, absolutely. But I like to think that most people do their volunteer work for the sake of the cause and for the enjoyment of helping the community, and not for the free t-shirt. It's important to preserve the value of clothing by not giving it away. So let your favorite nonprofit know that you don't actually support clothing giveaways. And I'm sure they'll actually end up appreciating it, as it will affect their bottom line. Don't throw out old garments or textiles. Bring them to Goodwill. Textiles can be reused for industrial purposes, if not resold. And also talk to Chittenden County Solid Waste about whether or not they will accept dirty textiles for recycling. The last I heard, they said that, I think on their website it said they would not accept dirty textiles, but I know in New York City, Goodwill accepts all donations, and they do take the dirty textiles or the old or worn out things, and they use them for industrial purposes. So definitely inquire what we have available to us in Vermont. Spread the word. Tell a friend what you learned today. Go online and learn more. Teach young people where fabric comes from. It is my belief that the world would be a better place if all high school students, both boys and girls, were required to create and sew their own dress shirt as part of their junior or senior year's curriculum. Sewing a button-down shirt to be used for future interviews would help them understand what goes into clothing making, the labor, time, and the craft. It would level the playing field for interview purposes. And of course, the benefit of everyone having a shirt and knowing how to fix their own clothes. If you're a designer or you work in the fashion industry and you're creating clothing for the rest of the country, I would encourage you to think about practicality. Think about what you own and love, and think about designing long-lasting, flattering basics and weather-appropriate gear. I also believe, and I've seen in all my experience in retail, that this leads to better sales and more loyal customers. If each piece is truly a work of art, customers will love it and they will come back for more. So, ultimately, we need our clothing. Even if we took perfect care of all of our garments and shopped exclusively at thrift and vintage stores, all of us, we would still need to replace a huge volume of high-use items after several years. Not to mention that if everyone stopped buying clothing new, I predict it would be about 10 years before most of what currently exists would be worn to shreds. So I think we can all agree that clothing does affect us. And why shouldn't we love our clothing? Why shouldn't we appreciate our favorite shirt, our perfectly tailored dress, our messenger bag? Our clothing gives us warmth, protection from the elements. We have collared shirts when we want to feel dignified. We have sandals for the beach, hiking pants for miles on the long trail. I go back to my original starting point, which is quality. We know quality when we see it, each one of us. I encourage everyone to pursue a higher standard for quality in clothing and clothing making, and to make local organic fashion the next big trend. After all, it already is. Thank you. So there's about 15 minutes left for questions, if anyone has any.
Sacred fabrics that you mentioned, silk, tencel. What is that actually made of?
Okay, so I'm going to grab something here. I had an earlier version of the lecture that went into a lot more detail about the textiles, and I didn't want to scare people, and I wanted to keep the talk a little shorter. But I'm going to try to find that section in the old speech that talks about it, because I've only been doing my own research and finding some of these things out myself. So let's see. Okay, I'm remembering now. So tencel is actually, I think it's made with lyocell as its content, which originates from wood pulp. However, it's farm raised in a sustainable way, and I believe they try to keep I think they try to keep the energy and water use very minimal. I think the problem, if I'm not mistaken, I think the problem with lyocell comes in dyeing, because apparently it doesn't take very well to the dye, so it needs a binding agent that is not necessarily environmentally fantastic, but at this point, a lot of what we're looking at with these fabrics is kind of the lesser of evils. So it's a matter of weighing, it's similar to any environmental issue, like energy or anything out there really, where we have to take a look at the big picture and try to do as little damage as possible. So I'll just triple check that in my old notes and make sure I had that. Okay. Yeah, biodegradable and low waste in its production with certain chemicals needed for dyeing and finishing for lyocell.
I'll add that it tends to be much structurally stronger than regular rayon, and because it's less processed, that's probably why. And rayon as a fiber compared to silk and things like that is structurally much weaker and is susceptible to heat and light and that kind of stuff. So it was made initially to emulate silk, and so but it's not as strong. But it's a great one. Because it drapes beautifully, like this work is drapes beautifully. It has a nice hand and this is a rayon. This is not a textile, it's just a rayon, but it's also
Thank you very much for.
I went to Parsons too, so.
Oh, okay, great.
I came to Vermont and stopped doing fashion, so. But your talk was fantastic because you really did a great job of covering all the aspects.
Yes.
If you were to create your ideal clothing label / tag with all of the, I guess ingredients, yeah. What would it look like, and how long would it be? I mean, it has to be bigger than just, a tag and a shirt.
So clothing labeling. Let's see.
Well, Hanes has it printed on like on a T-shirt or underwear instead of having it.
Right, they don't have an actual thing. Yeah, I think, well, with that question, I'll start by saying that I think if regulations were stricter, if everyone were required to adhere to certain regulations, similar to what we have now in Europe, in the EU, they've just adopted more stringent standards. If we had that, then we wouldn't necessarily need a massive clothing label to show us that there's formaldehyde and this and that in our clothes. So part of the process of demanding labeling might also encourage the government to rethink what is allowed.
Or maybe symbols could be used.
Right, or it could also be symbols.
It's the same with food. If you think about like anything that you eat that has more ingredients than 5 ingredients is like bad for you.
Right. Yes, it is, and it's a very parallel situation. But I'm not sure at what point the nutrition label was changed, but I'm kind of seeing a similar transformation moment with clothing where maybe we do need that long label, or at least we need to ask for it, so that someone does the testing at the very least.
And it doesn't have to be on the label and clothes. They're always attaching these
Attaching
separate
labels.
labels with their name and this and that. They can use like a cat, you know.
But also a lot of people are chemical sensitive, and more people these days are becoming chemical sensitive because of all these unknown dyes and contaminants in our clothing. So having a thorough label could be a huge service for the health of people who are dye sensitive, and probably for everyone else's health too.
How did you kind of assimilate into, I won't say the fashion community when you came to Vermont? Because when I came, I found it very, I don't know,
There wasn't one.
yeah. And so I actually do art quilts now instead of doing clothing. And so, but seeing this exhibit, it's still definitely in my blood. And I would love to know avenues to get involved in it, but I don't see any of it to get involved in.
Right, so how do we unite the independent people doing all these different things for fashion? That's a good question. If anyone wants to start a nonprofit, I'll join in.
Can I just say something that I go along to the farmers markets, and there are, like how you said about sheep and that, I know someone in my town that has goats that makes yarn for that, and there's different people that are on their own, like crocheting this or knitting that. And
Yeah.
I just think that's a good outlet that makes
Start
people
talking about
aware.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, there is a sewers guild that meets regularly. I haven't been able to make their meetings because of time conflicts. Obviously, fashion encompasses more than just sewers, but I mean, it could be one avenue to bring people together.
But that's more my strength in fashion is, when I lived in New York, I did production samples, I did
Okay.
so I was, my area, and I do think, and I don't know if you as an artist in this way, I want to start to find other people, like people to interact with. So that's been one of the challenges as well.
Yeah, well, I was hoping that just by speaking, maybe people would start thinking about how we could all kind of gather, because to answer your question, the first thing I did was go into a store and say, hey, I'm thinking of starting an organic clothing label, which I was at the time. You know, who can I talk to? Like, who around here does that? And I assumed that because it was Vermont, there would be all these people, because Vermont's, you know, the place that I thought would have that. And the girls just looked at me and they said, I don't know. And they said, oh, go talk to Doreen at BCA. She knows everyone. So I've really just gradually been meeting people on a case-by-case basis, and then, you know, I try to kind of bring them into what I'm doing. But yeah. Yes?
I think you gals who are doing this have a place you could start, and that would be with the artists, the picture people,
Right.
who for years, when they got to organize their studio tours and things like that, then people began to wake up and say, we've got a lot going on here. And then, so you're artists just the way they are, and they already have figured out how to merchandise it, figure out how they do it. Because when I grew up here, there wasn't any art. There wasn't, except here at the Shelburne Museum. And that's,
Right.
but you know, it was not art.
And I am part of that artist community too, because I do landscapes and I do the artist markets. But I actually think that a really good approach to this would be a designer's co-op.
Or at least like an art studio where people could,
Right. Yeah.
could be creating, you know, kind of amongst each other, or at least come in and show their work and
Yeah.
feature their work. Because I think you may not do the same thing, but you might be inspired by aspects of it, or you might say, oh, that's an interesting way to do that.
So, great. Were there other questions? I just don't want to anyone off, and I know we're short on time. Final time? Okay.
I have one question.
Yeah.
Sorry. Do you think that we consume too much, or that like we shop too much as a whole?
We shop too much. I think we shop too much.
Some people do.
went through all those boxes, yes, I definitely did think to myself that I shop too much. But, you know, do we shop too much? Do we eat too much? Do we spend too much time on our computers? You know, do we get enough exercise? Do we bike enough? I mean, you know, these are questions we kind of have to weigh on an individual basis. I mean, I think that the key is just to go back to just asking yourself, do I need this? Will I love it? You know, if you just started a new job and you have to have black pants, you know, you're gonna wear them every day for the rest of your life, get black pants. But I do also encourage people to rethink our cultural norms and expectations when it comes to clothing. And also, you know, when you make something yourself, when you make it from scratch and you finish it and you wear it, it's a great feeling. You know, and in the olden days, people used to do that and they had that one dress or two or whatever. I think that there's something to be said for that school of thought too. So, you know, and also the piece having a story to it. So, yeah, all of those things.
And one reason I went to sew was standard size.
Right. Sizing.
Instead of altering something to death, I figured when I start from scratch, I put the same amount of time into it, it will fit me properly. But, you know, not everybody has the interest in sewing.
And distribution of labor, you know, we don't all have the time, and that's okay. But we want to trust someone to do it for us the right way. So, yes.
You mentioned thinking about starting an organic clothing line, but you didn't.
No, I didn't. I haven't yet. In a word, money.
Yeah.
There's no better way to say it, really. I mean, I still do some of my own designing. I actually have a portfolio over there with some of the drawings that I've come up with and the fabrics and things. But it's also a question of time and interest. And, you know, when I wanted to get to know people in Vermont, and I found that doing my art and sharing it at the farmers markets and getting to know people in the artist community was a really great way to get integrated. And I love doing art. I mean, I'm inspired by landscapes and all sorts of other things. So I don't necessarily think that it's been a bad direction to be in at all. There's nothing that says I might not come back to doing clothing designing later. And I also really like helping other designers too, because especially up here, you know, I know that it takes a lot of resources to basically start your own business, which is what you're doing as a designer. And the more help you can get, the better. And so some of what I've been doing is helping local people try to merchandise, design, and market better. So bringing some of the skills that I have, and then also through teaching fashion drawing, getting people a knowledge base that they wouldn't otherwise have, which really gives Vermont a better shot at succeeding in today's, you know, global market. Because, you know, on Church Street you have everything available to you. You have the chain stores, and you have, so really trying to get Vermont's products and marketing to an industry level. So that's also part of what I've been doing, and then also taking illustration projects, which I love doing. So yeah, it'll be so much time.
How about more Vermont products on Church Street? Wouldn't that be a good goal for all of us?
Yes.
It's hard though because.
And that's the only place you have to really work, because the malls are all chain stores, so.
But Church Street used to have a lot more small stores.
That's right, and they're gone.
Unfortunately, it's kind of like I live in a town we don't have a bookstore. Well, the fact of the matter is the town probably won't support a bookstore. And
No,
why it's
that's
not
it.
there.
Look what's happened to them.
That's the
And then came the Kindle, like,
But that's why a cooperative election is
Right.
great.
A clothing cooperative.
Several designers could get together and they could afford to show their things, sell their things in
Right.
the shop.
Some of these people on Pine Street have done that.
Yeah, and also you have to keep in mind too that it's very fashion's very difficult because of fit and because of the niche that you're trying to fill in the market. So it has to be it's very specific. Quilts are easier to use. So it has to be just right. You know, you can't just put a bunch of clothes on a rack and expect people to buy them. So I think, it's important to treat it as a business, even if it is sort of a nonprofit endeavor. I've spoken with Frog Hollow. Part of the reason why they don't offer more clothing is because they know their customer. And their customer is generally a visitor, a tourist from out of town. Every so often for Christmas, the locals come out and they shop. But people visit,
I go there to look to see what.
right, to see what's there.
I don't know what's.
Right, but there's only so much room in the store, and for people to start trying on, a dress shirt or pants when they can get it in the mall, it's not feasible at this point. And also keep in mind, like I said before, who we're competing against. Because it's great to think, well, let's do something big and local and make it exciting, but that competition from the mall is still there. That competition is not going to go away, and that's part of the reason why we have to educate and think locally, tell people, basically kind of start a movement, and then also work on the chain stores too.
But I've done farmers markets and I do accessories, and the worst thing you hear is somebody go by and go, oh, I could get that at Walmart for less.
Yeah,
Well, they're the same.
Well, but they don't understand that. And
No,
that's the
exactly.
hard thing, is bridging that gap. Yes, there are people that will buy it and pay for it and appreciate it, but it's kind of like art, These paintings here, somebody might be willing to pay tens of thousands of dollars for it, but unless somebody appreciates it and understands it, they,
So it's a multifaceted issue, and a lot of it does come down to education, consumer awareness, for sure. Were there any other questions? And I'll be happy to show my art over there, and I have a couple little things over there for sale too, if you're interested. Thank you all for coming.